Welcome to the Vue.js lecture for the Programming User Interface class at Pratt Information School. Today we're going to be looking at specifically Vue, but first we're going to talk about what Vue is in relationship to the kind of JavaScript stuff we've been doing so far in class. Vue is a framework similar to many other frameworks that are trying to accomplish the same kind of idea. So you probably have heard of like React or maybe even Angular, which was a little bit before React came out. But today we're going to talk a little bit about what these are, and then we're going to do some examples specifically with just Vue.js. So these frameworks have been developed fairly recently in the last few years to help really make web development more like application development. Because if you think about what the web is, it's basically a way to deliver documents to your browser, right? So it's sending you HTML pages. These are static things. They were never intended to be these very dynamic multimedia interactive experiences from the beginning. So all these standards have had to be built upon this kind of like document-based origin of the web. So as you remember using other JavaScript processes like the vanilla JavaScript and jQuery, there's a lot of DOM manipulation, and so this is because you're manipulating a specific document and you have to move around elements and create elements and all that. That kind of makes application development where you're focused more on what the application does and not really as much on this nitty-gritty manual updating of the document. So what these libraries do is kind of abstract away the DOM into kind of something that's more abstract and kind of just works for you. You don't have to concentrate your effort on changing that one div, style, or changing that one element and moving it around. It kind of just does that for you. It's more focused on application logic and the variables. And so the way it does this is that it has a shadow DOM. And so this is basically an internal kind of lookup of the current document object model of the page. And it updates things inside the shadow DOM. And then when it needs to actually update the real web page, it makes those changes. So it can be very kind of judicious in what it updates. And so it makes it a little bit more efficient about what needs to change on the page and when. And so often you'll find that these applications that are created with these frameworks are single page applications. So traditionally a web browser, when you're using a web browser and a web page, there's often many different pages you click through, and each one of those is a separate request to the server. With these frameworks, often people are creating multi-page applications, but it's actually all just one single document that's sent to you. And so this is nice because it also reduces the amount of interaction you need with the server. So the server sends you one payload of files, the HTML, the CSS, and JavaScript, and then that just kind of takes over your browser, and it's a single page application. And it doesn't really have to make any more requests to the server outside, asking for new data and things like that. So doing this, you're able to create single page applications, which are much quicker and more kind of fluid to use to the user. So we're going to be looking at Vue.js specifically, and as I mentioned, there's a number of these libraries that we could have used. We're going to use Vue because I think it's a little bit more easier to get into than, say, React or Angular. React, you really need kind of like a whole pipeline of development pipeline to get things compiled and working together. With Vue, you can actually really just kind of drop it into a page that already exists and add some additional JavaScript, and it kind of just adds on to that functionality. They both are using the same idea of having this kind of shadow DOM and manipulating stuff behind the scenes and abstracting away that DOM manipulation for you. But I feel like Vue is a little bit, just easier to get started with. So the way we always begin, this is it's a JavaScript framework, so we need to figure out how to get it installed and we're going to be using Glitch again. So let's just take a look at their documentation. And Vue actually has some very nice videos that you can kind of come in here and review. But let's just get started quickly. We're going to use their CDN development JavaScript library. So they have one available for us that we can just include in our page. So let's go make a new glitch. So I'm just going to add the include file below the current script. And now that we have it included, we can start using it in our page. So the first thing we want to do is have a place where the Vue application is going to live. And so this is just basically a DOM element in the page that exists, similar to how, like last week when we did the leaflet example, you had to have an existing uh, DOM element to kind of hook onto. So we're going to make a new div. This is just where the application is going to live, and we'll call this, we'll give it an ID, and we'll call it app div, something like that. All right, so now that we have the div element, where the DOM element, which is a div where the application is going to live, we need to kind of instantiate the Vue application software, the framework, and get it up and running. And this is, you'd have to read the documentation because this is similar to the other frameworks we've been looking at. There's no standard way of doing this. You just have to look at the documentation for each library or framework you're using, and it tells you how to use it. But we know, for all of them, you need a script tag, right? So this is where the JavaScript is going to be. Inside the script tag, to start a Vue instance, you just need to define a new variable, call it my app or something like that. And you just need to say new Vue. And inside this function, because there's parentheses here, you pass an object, and the object contains all the information about your app. So one of the pieces of information you need to pass is the element that it's going to live in. And so our element is called appdiv. And what's interesting about Vue is that it's and all these frameworks is that it's kind of data driven, right? React is called React because it's reactive. So you change the data, and it reacts to the change in the data by updating the document object model. So it's really kind of data driven. So of course you need to have data defined for your application, right? And so this data lives in the key value pair data, and it comes as an object. You can define it as an object. And we don't have any data yet, so we'll say like some data. And we'll make that like our traditional nonsense text. All right, so this is kind of like the bare minimum that we need. And now what we can do is come up into our div where the application, the Vue app, is hooking into, and we can start accessing these data elements inside the app or inside the div. And so what is interesting with Vue and React and all these other ones is that it kind of parses the HTML that you defined and looks for its own kind of syntax, its own language within that HTML that you defined. So like we saw when we were using template variables and stuff like that, you have to know how Vue is expecting its template language to work. And so for Vue to reference one of these variables in your data, you just do these double curly brackets, and then you reference what variable you want to reference. So you notice there's no data. It's not like this. It's nothing like that. It's just some data. So this Vue is looking at this data element here, this data object, and it's looking for these keys when you're referencing them up here. So if we did everything right, we should be able to open this and see the results, right? So we didn't make a div element, right? We didn't make a div element specifically saying some data, right? So you could wrap this in a span. If you come back in here, you inspected it, you would see that it's in there as a span, right? So we're not changing this, right? We didn't say hi there in here, right? So it's populating the data directly into here from here. So whenever this would change, change in real time, it would update in real time. So let's give an example of that. So let's say we have a counter, right? This is going to be like 0, number-based counter. We could put that up here. The dollar sign, that's just, I'm just saying, or the number sign, and this is a string I'm putting in there. It could be, whatever. I'm going to say number, and then the variable we're going to use counter. Okay, or we could say something like that. I don't want the number sign to make it seem like it's doing anything special, because it's not. All right, so now if we go back and look at this again, right, it's 0, right, because the value we define is 0. And so what we need to do is need to have some way to modify the data. So we needed some way to update this data. And then once the data is updated, it will update it for us in real time in the DOM. So the way to do that in Vue is you can define these methods. And methods are like functions that, when in Invoke, they do something specific using the data, and it's all connected together. So let's say we have this counter and it's going to go up by 1, and then we need a function that increases it by 1, right? So we can make a new function called add 1 or something like that. This is going to be a function, and inside of the function, we're going to say, okay, access this data in this method or this function, you need to use the keyword this. So this is referencing the data. So you can say this dot counter equals this dot counter plus 1. Right, and if we looked at this now, it's not doing anything because that method's not being called, right? It's not being invoked. So now we need a way to invoke this. So you could have a number of ways of doing this, right? There could be like a timer that goes off every once in a while and increases it. But let's make this user-based. So we'll add a button, and we'll say, click to add 1. And so now we need to somehow to connect this button to this function, right? And so before, when we were looking at the vanilla JavaScript or even the jQuery, you'd define like an event listener, right? You'd give this a specific ID, and you say, okay, listen to this event, and whenever it's clicked, then add it to, run this function based on that clicking this. But for Vue, there's its own syntax defined. And again, so it's reading the HTML, it's pulling out the non-HTML pieces, the non-standard HTML pieces, and interpreting it according to its own syntax, its own language. So in Vue, there's a v-on command attribute, and you can just say click. Then inside of here, you say, what do you want it to do when this event happens? And so what you want to do is you just want to do one of these methods, right? So you can say, okay, v-on click, right? This is totally non-standard HTML. This is based on Vue syntax. You say, okay, on click, run this command. And then every time you click, it's going to run this command. This counter is the same as this counter, so it's going to add 1 to it. The Vue DOM is going to say, oh, this data changed. I better update the display of it in the HTML. So if we could try it again, every time we click, it's adding, right? So you can imagine just using these few lines of code, we have abstracted away all those necessary kind of like DOM manipulation elements, right? We don't need to check the value every once in a while or anything like that. Vue.js just knows it changed and updates our Vue for us, our HTML for us in real time. All right, let's do another example. Let's say that we want to add a to-do list, right? This is a classic hello world type thing. So let's make a to-do list. Right, so we're kind of building our HTML scaffolding here. And then of course we probably want to have like an unordered list. And then we'd have our list elements in here with all the stuff, right? All right, so now that we have our list stuff, or kind of like our HTML style defined, it's very simple, but that's good. We need some place to store the data, right? So let's do a new variable, and we'll say to do, and this to-do list will be a array, right? So the square brackets mean array. It's a sequence of data. It's a multiples of data. And so it's empty, right? If it was a list of things like strings, which is going to be, it look like this, right? When it's actually populated. But we don't have any items in our to-do list to begin with, so we'll just leave it empty. So now that we have a to-do list, we need some way to get information into the list, right? We need some method to get data into the list. So we just need to come down here. We're going to add a comma because if you have multiple things in an object, you need to separate them with commas. And we're going to define a new method, and we're going to say add to, right? This is going to be a function, and inside this function, we can access this to-do list variable with this .to-do. And in JavaScript, you wouldn't maybe need to look this up, but it's vanilla JavaScript. It has a method built into all arrays called push. Whatever you put inside the push adds it to the list. We don't have our way of adding. So we're just going to do like a static piece of data right now. So every time this clicks, or every time this invokes, it's going to add this new item to the list, and it's going to appear. We need it to appear here. So this means we need some way to bind this variable to this list items that don't yet exist here, right? The same way that we bound the counter to the DOM by using this variable. So again, you'd have to read how Vue is expecting you to use its syntax, but it has all these special ways of doing these kind of things. And one of the ways is using the attribute called v_for. And so if we've been doing for loops in our programming, so a for loop is a pretty standard term to us. So you usually use it to loop through things like lists or arrays or objects. And so you can say v_for, and then you say what variable you want to use for each loop, and then what do you want to loop through. So we could call it loop through our list items. So each loop there will be a list item, and we'll say in to do, right? So each time in this loop, there's going to be a list item variable, and that's going to be one of the things in the to-do list. So right now, it would recreate each one of these li elements for each loop in this to-do list. So we just need to reference what we want to appear in the HTML inside of here. So of course we want the list item to appear in there. Right, this is just my variable, so this could be X. Just whatever you want to call it. All right, so if we look at this again, there's nothing in our to-do list, right, because there's nothing in there, but we need this to be populated, right? So if this was populated with strings, you can see it automatically populates it, right? So we don't want it to be static, though. We need some way to add to this to-do list, right? So of course in HTML, to add text to something, to input text, that's going to be an input element. And you can say type text. This is all standard HTML, right? And you can put a placeholder. This is the kind of grayed out text that appears in an input box. So we'll say add to the list. So if we look now, we'll have a list here, or an input box that we could potentially do something with, right? So now we have two problems. We need to somehow listen to some way of adding this item, this text to the list, so to that to-do variable. So we need some events, right, to kick off adding that. And then we need to kind of pass whatever we have in here to that method we defined called add to. So if you read the documentation for Vue, there is another v_on event called keyUp enter. And so basically this is just this is the keyUp event, and then it has a enter a constant for you, so it makes things much more simpler. If you're doing this in vanilla JavaScript, you'd have to like add an event listener and then look for a specific like character code for what key was pressed. But with Vue, it kind of makes some shortcuts for us. So inside of the attribute for this file, we just need to tell it what we want it to do when this event happens. And so what we want it to do when that event happens is this method add to do. So Let's try it. We know right now this is kind of hard coded, so we should see every time you hit enter in this list adds a new item, right? No matter what you type in, right? So our next problem is that we don't want to just add a static text, right? We want it to actually add in whatever we typed in the input box, right? So what we can do is pass the event to our method. And so we did this a little bit in the vanilla JavaScript section, but we can see that this event is being passed to the here, and we have it available to be used. So we can do console.log, right? We always want to log stuff when we're interacting with it in JavaScript. So if we go back to our app, when we hit enter to pull off to evoke that event, we can see it logged the event, right? And so what you can do is come in here and see all the attributes that are associated with that event, and also the one we're interested in is target, right? So this is the DOM element that the event was triggered from, and in this case, that's this input box. So if we expand that one, it has all the attributes for that target or that input box in our case, and then what's nice is that it has a value. So if I had some text in here, which I sort of should have had, and go to that event that we just kicked off and go to the target, we'll see that there is a value of the text that is entered. So we have a way to access the value now of this input box when we hit enter. So instead of adding that constant new item to string, we could add the event target value. Right, this is the event being passed. It has that target and it has that value. So now if we typed in something and hit enter, it would add that something to our DOM element. Delete something else. So it might be nice if this kind of cleared itself every time you added one. So we can actually just do that pretty easily. We could say, we can read this here, but then we can also write to it. So we could say event.target value equals nothing after it's been added to our list, our array. So we can say something, enter. It cleared it out, right? Something else. So in an extremely limited number of lines of code, right? Really, this is really only one function doing this. We are able to do this would be many lines of code in vanilla JavaScript or even jQuery to listen to all these kind of events and stuff like that. So that's kind of a way you could build a simple to-do list using Vue with just a few lines of code. All right, so for our final example, let's look at using an API. So with these applications, if you do develop a single page application, you're not really receiving new data from the server, right? The HTML page is not being sent from the server every time you need to do something. So you really need to rely on using APIs to get data and to retrieve data and put data back to the server. So we did an example with an API using jQuery to kind of just load like an image from an API. So let's kind of recreate that in Vue to see how that would look. So the first thing we need to do is have some way to retrieve this API request, right? And so anytime you need to do some action, you'd want to make a new method. So let's make a new method. In this case, we're going to use that API that we used before, which returns a JSON message that has a link to a dog image in it, right? So our API is going to return some JSON that has the URL to a dog image, and then we want our app to show that dog image, maybe every time you click a button or something like that. So we need some method to initiate that request to the API and then do something with the data that's sent back. So let's make a new method. We'll say like get dog image. And this is always going to be a function. And then we don't need to pass the event here because we're not interacting with the DOM in that way, so we don't need to know who started the event. And so what we're going to do is we need a couple things. We need a way to interact with the web, and then we need the URL for the API, right? So we would need to, if this was an API that we're already familiar with, we need to go research how that API works, and do you need a key and all this other stuff. But we already know about this API, so we can just start with it. So similar to when we use the vanilla JavaScript, we're going to use the built-in fetch function. And so this fetch function is a native function that comes built into the browser. And it lets you do these JSON and other kind of asynchronous requests across to other APIs and other sites. So what we're going to do is the fetch takes the URL that you want to use for the API. So in our case, here's the API endpoint. So it's just going to return a random image URL for each random breed. And so with fetch, you're making these, in JavaScript, they're called promises. And so what you can do is resolve these promises and then do the next step to them. So with fetch, you want to say then. And so what do you want to do next? It's kind of like, all right, do this action, then do this, then do this, then do that. So the first thing we want to do is this API is going to return some information, right? So let's look at what it's going to return. It's going to return this little bit of JSON, right? We've seen this before. The problem is though that this is actually it's not assuming that you're going to be working with the JSON API, right? So you could be working with an XML API. The software doesn't assume it's going to be JSON. So like everything on the web, when it comes to your browser, it's just a big piece of text. It's like a big string, a big text piece. And so what we need to do is tell JavaScript to be like, hey, take this big piece of text. Actually, it is JSON, so turn it into JSON data. And so when it turns into JSON data, it becomes a JavaScript object that we can manipulate and access it, right? So the first thing we need to do is tell it to take the response that you're getting. So we'll say response text, right? This is just my variable. It can be whatever we want, but we're going to call it response text because that's what this is. It's text coming back to us. And we're going to use these weird arrow functions to pass the data into this function. And we're going to say, okay, the first thing I want you to do after you make the request is then turn this into JSON. So we could say, okay, return from this function this response text. And it has this method built into it called JSON. It just takes the text and parses it as JSON and returns the JSON object as a JavaScript object. So this is going to kick off the API. It's going to go through here. It's going to return the text that came back from the API into this function. It's going to return this text as JSON now. It's going to parse it. It's assuming it's JSON. And then we can just keep adding these then statements. So do this, then this, then this, then this. And so now, because this is being returned as JSON, now we have it here, or it's being returned as parsed JSON. It's actually now JavaScript data, right? So we could say dog image data at this point. So at this point, it's returned as data, and then before we go on further, let's just console log it to make sure that it looks right. So if we did everything right, it should request a random image, and then go through these two then statements, and then it should log the data that it got. So the next thing we need to do is have some way to invoke this this function, this method built into our methods. And so what we need to do is have some way in the DOM to kick it off, right? So we've already done this with our counter. We can just really just actually copy and paste this. Let's add some another H1 or something. Then we can add a button, right? So we're just going to paste this button. So we have this button and it's bound to a certain event. We don't want it bound to this add one anymore. We want it bound to this get dog image. So let's replace that. So now if we did everything right, every time we click the button, it should kick off this request to the API. It should parse the result as JSON and then pass that data into this last function, which then is just console logging it. So if we go to our page and go to our console and click the button, we can see that it's correctly doing that, right? So this is the data that's coming back from the API. It's a JSON object, so it's a JavaScript object. It has two key values pairs. The first key is message, and then the value of that message key is the URL, and then the second one is the status, and it's just saying, was your request successful? So this is what we're interested in. We're interested in the message, right? Because that's the URL. So if we want to be able to just print the message out, we would just need to use the dot notation, right? And we can just access this properties of the JavaScript object using dot and then the key name. So if we try it again, we would expect to see just the URL, right? So we're not printing out the whole JSON object. We're just printing out the one key value pair. All right. So now we have the data, and we just need to do something with it, right? So whenever we want to manipulate the DOM based on our data, the data needs to be defined in our data definitions. So let's make a new data definition for the dog image, or we'll say dog image. And we don't have a dog image to start off with, right? So it's nothing. We'll just leave it as an empty string. URLs are strings, right? They're not numbers. They're not Boolean variables. They're not lists. They're not objects. They're just empty strings. They're strings. So we'll make it an empty string to start off with. And so now the last piece we need is that every time, and then we want to update this, right? We don't want to just print. We don't want to console log it. We want to actually put it into our data. So the same way that we reference this.counter to reference that piece of data, we can say this.dog image, and then set it to whatever. And whatever we want to set it to is the piece of data coming from the API. Let's comment this out because we don't need to log it anymore. All right, so every time we click the button, it kicks this method off, which updates this piece of data here. And so now the last thing we need to do, right, is to make this reactive, is to add a binding to the data to an HTML element. And so, what HTML element would we want to use? Of course, we want to use an image, right? Because it's an image to display an image, a dog image. And so this is new, right? Because before we were editing the text of the element, right? The stuff in here. But with an image tag, right, we're not editing the text or the content of the element. We're editing an attribute, right? So there needs to be a source attribute with the link to the dog image in here. So of course you need to look at the Vue documentation to see how do you connect a piece of data to HTML elements attribute. And to do that, you do this attribute called vbind. So before, we're doing v on, but now for events and for binding data to attribute to do vbind. And then inside of colon, you say what attribute do you want to bind it to. We're going to bind it to the source attribute. And then you say, okay, what should that equal to? And then here we just say the dog image, right? You could say counter, and that would be 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 every time you click it. You could say to do, and that would be an empty list. That doesn't make sense. And for us, we're storing the URL in the variable dog image. So it's just going to look here to see what's there and set the source value in the HTML that the browser sees as whatever variable is, whatever value that variable has. So let's take a look at this. There's nothing there, right? Because it starts off as a empty string. But if we press this, it should make the API call. We can see that in our network tab here. So there's an API call, and then it changes the value of the source attribute, right? If we inspected this, we'd see that all that kind of Vue specific notation, Vue specific nomenclature is gone. It's just plain HTML that the browser knows how to render. But this is the JavaScript doing this all behind the scenes for you, using this shadow DOM and updating the real DOM whenever it needs to based on the data changes. So, every time we click this, they do another API call. Oh, big dog. And change the dog image, right? And of course, these are still HTML elements. So, sometimes we have got some very large dog images there. So you could just add a new class to this, right? You could say class equals dog image. And up here in your header, you could define new style elements and say, okay, class dog image should say max width is 300 pixels or whatever. Probably something better. And then that should limit the maximum width of the image. So let's try it. Yeah, right. So it's a little bit better. So even though this is like a Vue kind of DOM element, you can still use CSS and style it however you want it to be, because the Vue.js doesn't care about how you're styling things. It just cares about what data element is it bound to, and then the events that interact with it. So with that, I think we'll end. And until next time, thanks and bye.